Welcome, everyone. Welcome to this month's Understanding ADHD speaker series hosted by the ADHD Empowerment Meetup community and the nonprofit Children and Adults with ADHD, or CHADD for short, of the San Fernando Valley, Los Angeles. It's a mouthful. I'm Suzanne, our executive director. I'm also an adult with ADHD and mom to a third grader with ADHD. CHADD's been hosting this particular speaker series for the last 5 years, bringing experts on the topic of ADHD directly to the community. This event is just a part of our work to educate, support, and advocate for adults and children living with ADHD. We also host online peer support groups for adults with ADHD, young women with ADHD, and parents of ADHD children. All our groups are facilitated by our dedicated volunteers, and all of our work is funded by donations. Because we want to ensure that everyone who needs ADHD education and support can receive it, there's never a fee to attend our events. However, we are a nonprofit organization and our survival does depend upon donations and membership fees. So we kindly ask that if you're able and you find our work worthwhile, you consider making a $5 or $10 donation tonight to help support our work. One of our volunteers will post the donation link in the chat. I'd like to share a few meeting guidelines and recommendations just to help you get the most out of tonight's meeting. We suggest for your privacy that you set your Zoom name to just your first name and your general location. Please mute your audio during the presentation. We ask that you not unmute to speak unless you're called on by the facilitator, just because it's really hard for everybody to hear our guest speaker if everyone else isn't muted. We encourage you to use the chat feature throughout the meeting to share your ideas, your questions, and you can do that when the speaker's talking or when someone else is talking. Feel free to just do it throughout the meeting. Let's see, and then during the Q&A portion of the evening, please use the chat feature to type your questions, and our moderator will get to as many questions as possible. We like to just start off before we introduce our presenter with a brief evidence-based overview of what ADHD is and how it impacts individuals. That way we're all on the same page. ADHD is a lifelong neurobiological disorder. It impacts brain function in a way that impairs executive function, delays social emotional development, and impairs our self-regulation. So rather than thinking of individuals with ADHD simply as having too much energy, which some people call hyper, or too little energy, which some people call inattentive, or worse, lazy, a hallmark of ADHD is actually impaired self-regulation. So trouble getting our bodies and our minds in the right frame for the task at hand. So sometimes we might have too much energy, more than the situation calls for. This is a hyperactive state. Maybe we get too focused on a project and forget to walk away to eat or use the bathroom for hours, also known as hyperfocus. Maybe we get excited about a new idea and ramble on to a friend without realizing we didn't let them speak. Then there's times when our bodies and minds regulate with less energy or attention than the situation calls for. This is an inattentive state. So maybe we zone out while taking a test or having a conversation with someone on a topic that doesn't really interest us. This can also show up as trouble getting started in the mornings or getting motivated and organized to do something challenging like paying bills. Individuals with ADHD can veer towards hyperactive or inattentive, or be a mix of the two. For people with ADHD, getting our bodies and our minds to cooperate and serve up just the right amount of attention and focus for the task at hand can be extremely challenging. But studies show that if ADHD is not diagnosed and well treated, that ADHD-related challenges can significantly decrease an individual's life expectancy. This information is really hard to hear, especially for those of us that are parents with little ones. But it's good to know. The good news is that there are studies that show that life expectancy and outcomes are dramatically improved by two things: a proper diagnosis and a lifelong holistic treatment plan. Holistic treatment plans include things like combination of ADHD education, skills training, medical treatment, and peer support. And the important part of that is that treatment should be lifelong because ADHD is a lifelong condition. So this is our last slide. Understanding ADHD also means understanding the brain's executive functions, because those functions are delayed and impaired in individuals with an ADHD diagnosis. These functions are what help individuals manage and regulate our planning, decision-making, learning, judgment, emotions, and actions. And there are several of them: activation, focus, effort, emotions, memory, and action. And they all work together at different times and in different amounts and in different combinations, depending on what we're trying to accomplish. Something important to know about executive function skills is that they can be strengthened and developed. So you can think of them like a muscle. So often with medication and other treatments, receiving executive function coaching or learning how to strengthen those skills can be a strong way to support the executive function challenges that ADHD brings. So with that, I am so pleased to welcome back licensed psychotherapist and ADHD certified clinical specialist, Kristin Baird Goldman. Kristin runs an integrative psychotherapy practice and ADHD center in the LA area, where she and her team help clients understand that we are all a combination of nature, genetics, and nurture environment. Tonight, Kristin will help us bust some ADHD myths by sharing current scientific data, therapies, treatments, and help us get a better understanding of how the brain-body connection of ADHD works so that we can all better manage our challenges. And tonight, we're actually going to do things a little bit different. We usually have a Q&A at the end, but tonight our Q&A will be during the actual presentation. So I am going to hand it over to Kristin so that she can share her screen with us. And we will get started.
Great. Thank you, Suzanne. Hello, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for joining tonight. As Suzanne mentioned, my intent for this evening is to bust the stigma and myths that surround ADHD. There are many. I selected the top 12 that come up often. Being an LMFT and specializing in the ADHD population, as well as being an adult with ADHD, these are the myths that I hear most often in my office, and the ones that I come across from parents and from adults and from teens. And, as with science keeps developing and evolving, so is the information that we have, particularly about the brain and the brain related to ADHD. And so every day, new information is coming out. But I think more importantly, my intention is, some of this information may not be new to many of you, and hopefully you've invited other individuals, loved ones, or friends, because I think it is a great overview of how to educate those who really don't understand ADHD. Or maybe you received a recent diagnosis yourself and you're still learning and educating yourself. So with that being said, I'm going to start with the first section. So ADHD has evolved over the years. In the 1960s, it was labeled hyperkinetic reaction of childhood. It made the DSM officially in 1968, and this is how it appeared. And then in the 80s, we heard ADD, and there was no real subtypes. They would just say ADD with hyperactivity or ADD without hyperactivity. And then in 1987, it was officially coined ADHD, Attention Deficit Hyperactivity Disorder, that combines inattentive impulsivity and hyperactivity, and it was all lumped into one. The three subtypes, as Suzanne mentioned earlier, inattentive, hyperactive, impulsive, and combined, were all broken out. And in the Diagnostic Statistics Manual, the DSM, that's how it appeared for a really long time, up until 2013, when now it is being stated as three presentations, which are all the same as the subtypes. The language you will see on the internet and in books is going to be all over the place with this. You'll see subtypes referred, you'll see presentations referred, you'll still see ADD. And you know, that's probably one of the biggest questions I get from clients and individuals is, what is the difference between ADD and ADHD? There isn't one. There are a lot of people who use the term ADD when they do not have the hyperactive impulsive presentation. But the way it is medically identified, it is ADHD with those types or presentations underneath of it. But there, individuals use ADD and ADHD interchangeably. And the problem is that because there's so much different information out there, and because of the access to social media, there are now a numerous amount of myths that surround this condition. And it's unfortunate because all of these inaccurate beliefs are creating a lot of stigma and shame around a disorder with individuals who for the majority are holding on to a lot of shame as it is, and it's just getting perpetuated. So first myth, ADHD is not a real disorder. I, even in creating this presentation, because I've had to revise it over the last couple of years with new information, and even when I typed this into the search engine, I wanted to see what came up, and I'm still amazed at the amount of individuals, professionals who still claim that this is not a real disorder. We know that this is a neurobiological, medically recognized disorder. A person doesn't have ADHD simply because he or she becomes distracted or engages in impulsive behavior. You know, any one of the symptoms doesn't also necessarily qualify you to be ADHD. It's really only a trained healthcare professional can accurately diagnose you with ADHD. And the testing, as we will go through later, is pretty complex. So what is ADHD? Well, in a nutshell, neuroscience, brain imaging, and clinical research tell us a few important things. Most importantly, what it's not. ADHD is not a behavior disorder. It is not a mental illness, and it is not a specific learning disability. Many of us, including myself, don't even believe it to be a disability. Some of the renowned experts like Hollowell and Barkley and Russell Ramsey all would agree that this is not a disability. Dr. Ned Hallowell would even argue that this is a disorder. And he is on the path of trying to change the terminology that's used around ADHD. What we do know is it is a developmental impairment of the brain's self-management system, the executive functions that Suzanne talked about earlier. Both adults and children are diagnosed with ADHD, and the symptoms vary by the subtype or presentation of inattentive, hyperactive, or combined, which is the DSM lists inattentive and its symptoms and subset of symptoms under that, and hyperactive impulsive and its subset of symptoms under that, and combined type, an individual will check off boxes of both. And it's a very complex condition to truly identify, and it is very difficult to diagnose in the female population and in the adult population predominantly. Does anyone have any questions regarding ADHD in general, and any thoughts about this being a real disorder versus not being a real disorder?
I have a question.
Hi. Oh, hi, Elise. We're actually asking people to type their questions in
Sorry.
chat. That's okay. No problem. Good to see you. We actually have a question from Heather. If it's not a disability or disorder, then what does it mean for people who need accommodations in the workplace or academia?
So it is recognized under the Americans with Disabilities Act. And a lot of that is because it's been termed as a disability or a mental health disorder. It is not a disease. It is a condition. It is chronic. It is not curable, as we know. Specifically for students in getting accommodations, it's really challenging unless the student has a specific learning disability that's been identified. It's really hard to get the accommodations, even under the Americans with Disabilities Act. Teachers fight it and the schools fight it. And so it can be a real challenge. I think the word disability is being used because no one really knows how to explain or understand the impairment of the executive function system. And so in order to get the accommodations in the workplace or in the schools, we have to sort of lump it under that umbrella in order for it to occur. But for yourself and in general, you should not view this as a specific learning disability. There are learning disabilities that come alongside having ADHD, but those need to be identified separate from the ADHD diagnosis. Hope that helped.
Thank you for that. And I will just say too that it's a similar way to think about it. Like when we look at children and we look at IEPs, for instance, ADHD itself is not something that qualifies one for an IEP. However, unspecified, or I forget what the term is, but it's other learning disabilities that are often co-occurring with those deficits in executive function, other health impairment. Thank you, Odette. I appreciate that. Let's see, there's another question. If the impairment is severe enough, can it be disabling? I had accommodations for ADHD in school, and it wasn't difficult to do so at my college.
The impairments itself, the symptoms can be disabling to individuals, but it is not, again, it's not identified as a specific learning disability. If there are impairments to the executive function system, chances are that that's a red flag that there's a specific learning disability that's occurring and popping up, like dysgraphia, dyslexia, dyscalculia. A lot of individuals who have ADHD and these impairments go unrecognized in the learning disability category. So that's generally what's coming up in that situation.
And isn't it true that, we had a speaker talking about executive function, and she was explaining to us how, with ADHD, one of the aspects of it is executive function disorders. And so those disorders are disabling and allow for accommodations and things like that.
Yeah, I mean, individuals who have ADHD have executive function impairment. There are individuals who have executive function impairment that do not have ADHD.
Exactly, that was what she was saying. Thank you for clarifying that. And this is a loaded question, but there's a lot of talk about this right now. Do you agree with how ADHD is named? Because it feels more like a regulation of attention instead of deficit or hyperactivity. So that's a good question, because I know even Dr. Hallowell he's pushing like a different term for it, and a lot of us feel like it's very confusing to people outside of our community. It's hard. It doesn't really explain what we go through on a daily basis.
No, it doesn't. And yes, Dr. Hallowell is trying to push this vast acronym out there. And it is. There's a lot of myth, I think, around this term because it's not correct in the first place, right? I'm sure I'm coming up on that slide, but I often let individuals know ADHD is not a disorder of not being able to pay attention, right? It's about the fact that your brain pays attention to everything all at the same time and cannot determine at what point in time what should it focus on now.
With the same intensity sometimes.
Yes. Yeah. So we are hoping that with the next DSM, this term gets changed, because just the label itself, it's just not right.
Yeah, we've heard that that's coming up, I guess, this year, right? That we might be looking at that.
Yeah.
All right, great.
Okay, I'm going to move on to myth number 2. A simple test can determine if someone has ADHD. Unfortunately, no, there is no simple diagnostic test that can specifically identify ADD or ADHD. You know, it's not like a medical disorder where if you're looking for diabetes, something similar that you can take blood tests and other types of tests to find out the biology and what's going on. There are standardized ways of diagnosing ADHD. And again, there's not even a formula that everyone uses that's the same. Every professional has their set of diagnostic tools that they like to use, and it's different across the board. What we try to do is gather as much information as possible. We want to know a patient or client's history. We use interviews and observations. We do assessments. We'll get school records or information from adults' partners or family members. It takes quite a bit to get to that place of making an accurate diagnosis because there's a lot of overlap with ADHD symptoms with a lot of other diagnoses out there that are in the brain health as well as the biology of individuals. So this is a question I hear a lot. Are there blood tests or brain imaging tests to diagnose ADHD? We don't have any biological tests to date to diagnose ADHD. Like I mentioned before, the diagnosis is based on clinical history and observations. There's a lot of talk right now about neuroimaging or brain imaging, and MRIs and fMRIs and EEGs and QEEGs. And while that's giving information, it's still not conclusive enough. Not enough studies have been done. It's because it's very time consuming and expensive. So much research is still in the labs. You know, we do know that ADHD is a deficiency of norepinephrine and dopamine, but it's different for everyone, the amount of norepinephrine and dopamine. You know, I've heard many scientists say, you know, the medications are directly go to dopamine, but we don't have a medication to date that goes through the norepinephrine pathway before it hits the dopamine. And when we can figure that out, that'll make a huge difference in the response to medications. But for now, you know, there's a lot of information on the internet you have to be careful of because there's a lot of claims that certain brain imaging scans and fMRIs can diagnose ADHD, and the bottom line is we're just not there yet. But it's evolving, and hopefully we'll get there someday.
Thank you. And the next question is, I know you're going to like, because you're so into all this. So Elise wants to clarify, current medication for ADHD mainly just, this is what she wants to clarify, it mainly just boosts dopamine. Why is it so difficult to have a medication that goes through the necessary neural pathways to the dopamine?
Because as a lot of people understand, and we'll get into medications in a few slides, but the stimulants impact dopamine, but a lot of people can wind up getting too much dopamine with the stimulants, right? It's very difficult to find the correct balance. And each neural pathway is connected to another. And in order to give an individual the proper amount of dopa or dopamine, it's the only thing that the stimulants are really addressing, and they're not addressing the norepinephrine factor enough. And so what happens is a lot of people complain, adults and parents of children, of my child crashes, my child gets mean or irritable or even aggressive when they're coming down or off. Those are all indications of getting too much dopamine. It's just not a good thing. And the science just hasn't figured out what the proper pathways, how to get to the proper pathways yet. As we know, the brain is really complex.
Great. Thank you.
Okay, I am going to move on. So ADHD is just a childhood disorder. So many of this is a very common myth out there, but the information does keep changing because more adults are starting to be identified, which is great, right? So it affects children, it affects teens, and it affects adults. To date, it is estimated that approximately 6.5 million school-aged children are affected by ADHD, and that 10.5 million US adults have been diagnosed with ADHD. That does not include the still somewhat large percentage who are undiagnosed. And we'll get into that in a second, but it does keep changing, and that is actually a good thing. So what does ADHD in adulthood look like? So symptoms in ADHD are similar to those in childhood. However, as we get older, the presentation and the intensity of the symptoms tend to decrease a bit, particularly hyperactivity. So in the past, people thought that children were outgrowing their ADHD because the majority of individuals with ADHD that were getting identified were the hyperactive sort of stereotype of the condition. And as they got older, the hyperactivity just weaned down a bit. And so it was thought that you outgrew it. And this was a belief in the 80s and probably even in the 90s. But adults who experience co-occurring conditions like depression or anxiety can make it a little more challenging to identify ADHD, and often they'll get misdiagnosed. Because of the co-occurring symptoms, the ADHD just is not, they're overriding any ADHD. And a lot of that is, again, is the professional that someone is seeing trained to see it as well and know the overlaps between many other conditions. Also, adults are really good at masking or camouflaging their symptoms, especially if they've not been identified in childhood. They've found coping strategies that they feel work. They've learned to sort of mirror others, and it makes it even that much harder to identify it. But to a lot of individuals, you know, I had many adults who will say, you know, my friends or family members don't believe I have ADHD. They'll say, "You what? You've got yourself together." Because adults can be very good at masking, and that is one of the reasons why there's a pretty numerable percentage of why it's getting missed. Any thoughts on adulthood and ADHD?
Doesn't look like we have any questions on that.
Okay.
I do. I'm still typing it out though.
Do you want to just say your question, Elise?
Sure. What is the medical difference between hyperactivity and anxiety? Because like you said, I agree that it would be very difficult to differentiate them because they have some overlap, I would guess.
Yes, very much so.
So like, how do you figure out like which is which?
Well, I mean, hopefully you're working with a trained professional who understands the differences and nuances of each. You know, when I'm working with clients, I'm always trying to determine whether is the anxiety a result of untreated and undiagnosed ADHD, or is it happening alongside of the ADHD? Sometimes when someone is trying medication, it can kind of let us know if the ADHD symptoms are feeling more managed and the anxiety starts to be, the spotlight gets put on the anxiety. And it becomes very apparent that the anxiety is now something that's happening alongside of the ADHD and not because of the ADHD. But it just takes a real trained professional to understand the difference of both.
So to clarify, so if somebody is on ADHD medication and their anxiety increases, is it possible or more likely that the anxiety is not caused by the ADHD if anxiety is increasing?
Most likely. I mean, we also want to look out for, is the medication increasing the anxiety? Because some of the ADHD medications can do that for individuals, but it usually does that for people who already have an underlying anxiety disorder to begin with. It doesn't necessarily create anxiety all by itself. I hope that helped.
One other quick question we had was, I've been told that ADHD gets worse as we get older. Does it get worse?
Okay, so it's not necessarily that it gets worse. What happens is most often adults are identified when their children, if you have children, when their children are getting identified. They bring the children to the doctor's office and the doctor reads a list of all of the symptoms and traits. And one of the parents are sitting there going, yes, 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 in their mind. And that's how a lot of parents wind up getting identified. I would say for women specifically, it can be a challenge. For men and women as parents, it's a challenge because you're no longer having to manage yourself. You're now managing other people's schedules, and the executive function system is getting very taxed at that point. Women, I mean, this could be a whole topic for an entire discussion, but due to their hormones, childbearing years and perimenopause, premenopause, postmenopause years, because of the direct connection between estrogen and dopamine and norepinephrine, can be challenging. And that's why it's really important to be working with professionals who understand, and you can get the support that you need. So it's not necessarily that it gets worse. It's just that when children are involved, the executive function system kind of goes in overload.
Thank you.
Okay. So ADHD is just an excuse for people who are lazy or lack willpower. There's a lot out there right now, a lot of individuals writing about laziness and willpower and how they technically don't exist. But more importantly, what people aren't understanding is that individuals with ADHD, because of their self-management system being at a deficit, their sluggishness and or lack of motivation can appear as laziness. Can't tell you how many times I've heard a parent call their child lazy, particularly for older generation. We've heard that as kids quite a bit. And it's unfortunate because now there's many adults walking around with this sort of guilt and shame of this idea of being lazy. But more importantly, individuals with ADHD, their interactions in the social place, the workplace, school, it's really challenging to manage all of that. Like I said earlier, the ADHD brain wants to take in all bits of information all at the same time. And so it requires a significant amount of effort to stay focused, either at school or at work. And it's taxing on that executive function system. And so some people, by the time they come home, they're depleted. And it can mistakenly be identified as laziness when really that's not the fact. And every person I know with ADHD has a lot of creativity and energy when they're passionate and interested in something they want to do. And it has been researched that, if a person with ADHD is on the right track, they can accomplish a whole lot more than individuals who don't have ADHD. So if it isn't laziness, what is it? As I said earlier, this unmotivated, lazy, or even apathetic labels are terms that are being used for a person's presentation of immobility and sluggishness. And that's often quite a part of ADHD. In fact, there is a part of ADHD that's often not talked about, called sluggish cognitive tempo. And that's like the complete opposite of what the hyperactive impulsive type presents as. And these are individuals whose executive function system, namely the processing speed and working memory, are at a slower rate. Has nothing to do with intelligence. Executive function system has nothing to do with our intelligence. But those are skills that are hard and harder for individuals with ADHD because the wiring in the brain is not setting them up for success. And so they have to work really hard at trying to manage some of their deficits in that management system, which is why it's so important, I think, for people to get an education on ADHD and to educate the individuals in their lives about ADHD to kind of tone down the misperceptions that surround it. Any thoughts on laziness in ADHD?
One question about executive function. So in talking about how we can strengthen our executive function skills, what are some of the best ways for we hear a lot about like how children can improve their executive function skills, but what are some of the ways that adults might be able to do that?
Well, in a few slides, I will touch on some approaches that are becoming more widely used. But in the interim, I would say that it's important to get an understanding of what executive function deficits an individual has, right? Their executive function system is organization, planning, prioritizing, motivation, self-regulation, and emotional regulation. And when I'm working with my clients, I do an executive function assessment to determine which of those areas, and time management, sorry, which of those areas are causing the greatest amount of difficulties and impacting a person on a daily basis. And once we're able to uncover what that is, then there's a variety of tips and tricks and tools that and strategies that someone can apply to each one. But it's hard to give a general overview without knowing exactly what areas are involved.
That totally makes sense because everybody with ADHD has a different mix of how their executive function deficits are. And so somebody like I'm completely time blind. And so an executive function coach or a therapist might help me with that aspect of it, but I might not need help with emotional regulation or something. So you're saying it has to be tailored to the person. Okay, yeah. Thank you.
Sure. Any other questions on that?
Nope, that was it.
Okay.
Oh, well, we do have one. Where do you get an executive function assessment?
It depends on the professional. It's one of the first things I do when I'm working with a new client, even if they already have an ADHD diagnosis and I'm not looking to assess one. I always feel it's important to do this. The one I use is Dr. Russell Barkley's. It's called the BDEFS. And it's really about finding a professional who really understands that. There are lots of different executive function assessments out there. And, finding a trained professional that looks specifically only at the executive function system is the best path to take. Okay, so here's a myth that I get from a lot of parents. Poor parenting can result in ADHD. So it is not caused by bad parenting or by anything you or a loved one has done. It It is about applying more discipline without accounting for the symptoms of ADHD that might not help. There are a lot of parents who either have ADHD or have ADHD children who don't understand how to parent the ADHD child. And it's different. You know, there's a million parenting books out there with all different views and approaches to parenting. But when you're parenting an individual child with ADHD, there, as with all parenting styles, there is a wrong way to go about it, and there's a more positive approach to take. And, you know, that's setting clear and consistent expectations, establishing a home environment with predictable routines, and, you know, understanding, particularly for yourself as a parent, that you are not creating the symptoms, the ADHD symptoms that you're seeing in your children. But this is a neurodevelopmental genetic disorder. And so they may have received some of your genetics, but your parenting is a result of ADHD. Your certain parenting styles can be a challenge and create some friction in the house, but it's not necessarily because of that. So I'm often asked, what are some of the tips in parenting the ADHD child? Right? It's really about combination of compassion and consistency, self-care, stay positive and healthy, establish a structure and stick to it. ADHD kids, as much as they fight structure, thrive under structure, as do adults with ADHD. Encourage movement.
Thank you, Mama.
Individuals, you know, really, we all benefit from exercise, but the ADHD brain really benefits from exercise and sleep. And, you know, those are two, I know, challenging things for a lot of individuals with ADHD to acquire, but it's definitely worth, with your children, in establishing good exercise and sleep routines, setting clear expectations and rules. You know, when a parent says, you know, clean your room, the ADHD child or teen, that statement alone, their brain just went like, what does that mean? Where do I start? You know, they go into overwhelm and then they shut down. So it has to be chunked down, broken down into specific tasks. Let's start with the shoes tonight, right? And so when I say set clear expectations, it's being very clear, chunking down the information in small bits. It's an accommodation that is often requested at school and should occur at home at the same time. Help them eat right. Diet is a huge component, and there's a lot of connections, as I will discuss later, with ADHD. Help them with their social skills. ADHDers do have some challenges in the social skills and the social emotional component of things. And so, you know, telling your child to do one thing versus modeling it for them is very different. So that's who you can help them with the social skill development. Keep things in perspective and don't sweat the small stuff. Believe in your child and let them know you believe in them. Seek support. It's can be very challenging to do this on your own. There's a lot of support systems and resources out there, and I always suggest using them. And take breaks. You know, if you're finding that you guys are at a tug of war, it's not worth it, right? And so take a break and show your child that you're taking a break. Those sort of mindful pauses is another opportunity to model for them. And kids are sponges, they'll suck it up. Any thoughts on parenting and ADHD?
Do we have any questions? I know we have a lot of parents. I guess I have a question. Do you have any advice for those of us that are parents with ADHD, that are parenting children with ADHD? Because it's modeling is so important, and it's really challenging sometimes to model when your own skills are lacking.
Yes, I understand that completely. You know, I often let people know, including myself, that while we might not necessarily always model the appropriate response because of our own reactivity in certain situations, and a child's ADHD symptoms trigger an adult's ADHD symptoms, and you kind of get caught in that cycle. It's about the repair. That's the most important thing. And that's what kids walk away with. They don't necessarily remember the disagreement or the argument or the yelling. If you come to them owning and taking responsibility for your part, again, an opportunity to model, wow, I really got dysregulated there. Showing how to take responsibility for your actions and letting them know you're human too, and we make mistakes.
Thank you.
But it's all about the repair.
Yeah, that's important. We had another question, and I think it's a really good one. So I think a lot of times those of us with ADHD are not, I think self-awareness is one of those executive functions that, we have trouble monitoring ourselves and kind of knowing what we need. And so the question that we have is, how does somebody with ADHD know if they're getting the support they need, like the level of support that they need, when ADHD makes it so hard to know what one needs? And if that's not completely clear, like I have an example that over the last couple of weeks, like I thought I was doing really well, and then one additional thing got added to my plate, and it kind of took my husband saying to me, like, hey honey, guess what, like you have 3 more things than you had last week, so if you're a little frazzled, like that's why. But I couldn't see it myself. So how do we make sure we're getting the level of care that we need when it's hard for us to kind of see outside ourselves?
Well, I'm a really big proponent and believer of mindfulness, right? Mindfulness, as I will mention in a few slides, teaches us about that self-awareness. And, individuals with ADHD are gifted with insight and intuition. But it can get clouded at times due to triggers of the executive function system. And practicing mindfulness teaches us and builds that skill of being able to pause and step back and create some self-awareness of what do I really need, right? What, particularly as a parent, we start to apply all the self-care skills to our children, and we forget about ourselves. And even adults who don't have children, the focus can go to their career or to their partner. So, again, in my opinion, it's really about the mindfulness and applying it as much as you can, meaning just try to be in the present moment. Take a pause for a second and ask yourself, what am I feeling and what do I need right now? Okay. Myth number 6, ADHD affects only boys. So yes, while back in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, predominantly only boys were getting diagnosed because their stereotype symptoms were so present, and it was hard to avoid. Unfortunately, over the decades, girls have been sitting in classrooms because they're quiet or daydreamers, going completely undiagnosed. So there is no gender difference. It affects as many boys as it does girls. But because the presentation can look very different, it often goes unnoticed. ADHD in girls are not always, but there's a larger percentage of girls or females that present with the inattentive presentation or subtype. Doesn't mean that they don't have the hyperactive or impulsive, but it is, if you're a female, and particularly if you are a student, if you have some intellectual gifts and you're quiet, it will completely go unnoticed, right? If there's no real academic red flags coming up, it is often one of the main reasons why inattentive type doesn't get noticed. But the symptoms are definitely more subtle. If someone has hyperactivity or impulsivity in girls, it can look a lot like anxiety. You know, people call it the hidden disorders when it comes to females, even women and adults. I would say what's even harder to diagnose girls is the male population who are inattentive, is just as challenging and goes just as unrecognized as the female population does. Any questions or thoughts on girls and women and ADHD?
No questions, but that's a great point. I appreciate you adding that part in. My own son is inattentive, and it's you know, it's challenging, just as challenging as it is sometimes for girls to get diagnosed.
Yeah, and unfortunately, those are boys who get labeled lazy, right? Because they don't fit the stereotype that's still associated with the disorder. So myth number 7. Why can my kid be on video games for hours? They couldn't possibly have ADHD. And I hear this a lot, even with adults. And if it's not video games, it's something else. But it's really common for a child with ADHD to be distractible in one setting and highly focused in other settings. This is where hyperfocus comes into play. ADHD doesn't mean that there is no attention. It means dysregulated attention, as I said earlier. The brain wants to process every bit of information from all senses all at the same time. And so environments and activities that are highly stimulating can actually lead to hyperfocus. And the other part, particularly with video games, is that video games are like a stimulant for the ADHD brain. It is a constant dopamine reward. With every level, with every bell or whistle or sound you get of achievement, you are getting a squirt of dopamine. And so obviously we like that. It feels good. There's a sense of accomplishment that's coming up. And so why would you want to stop? But you know, more mundane and less stimulating settings, that's when you're going to see a child be more distractible. So, you know, I hear this from a lot of parents of, you know, I don't understand. And a lot of it is about hyperfocus. What is it, or is it a bad thing? Not necessarily. Hyperfocus can be an ADHD or superpower, right? A lot of individuals use it for productivity, and it can be an asset, but it's got its drawbacks too. And particularly when we're hyper-focused on a task that's kind of frivolous and usually one that is avoiding the main task at hand. So being able to channel your focus on something productive in school or work, and allowing yourself hyperfocus can lead you to a more reward, completing a dull task and getting you through that. But unrestrained, intense focus can be a liability, and if left unchecked, it can lead to failure in school, lost productivity on the job, difficulty in relationships and friends and your home. I know it is, as I will mention soon, is the disorder of inconsistency, right? There are times where you or your child will outperform, and there were times where you will underperform. And it all goes back to that executive function system and the neurotransmitters in the brain. Any questions on hyperfocus? Okay.
We're good, thank you.
Children with ADHD eventually outgrow their condition. As I mentioned earlier, We don't outgrow it. More than 70% of individuals who have ADHD in childhood will continue to have it in adolescence and adulthood. It's estimated that 6% of the adult population has ADHD. Like I said before, 10.5 million Americans. And there is a majority of adults that remain undiagnosed. Without help, adults with ADHD are highly vulnerable to mood disorders such as anxiety, depression, or substance abuse, and they can experience difficulties in their career, financial, legal problems, and issues in their personal relationships. But you do not outgrow ADHD. As mentioned before, the symptoms get quieter sometimes, and for some adults, particularly new parents, they get louder. So how and why does ADHD change? Right, a child who displays hyperactivity in childhood, who no longer displays that later in life, one can walk around with the misperception that they've outgrown it, but even the symptoms of inattention, impulsivity, and disorganization will always remain. And more importantly, if the symptoms quiet for a while, the brain, the effect on the brain is still there. The genetics of the ADHD and the impact on the brain will always be there. If you're finding strategies that are working and improving things, then that is great. But as I mentioned earlier, due to environmental circumstances and biological circumstances, the presentation of ADHD can change throughout the lifespan. Any questions or thoughts on that?
Let me see. So Danny has a question. He says his presentation is also the inattentive type, and he's in the process of getting diagnosed. He's looking for suggestions on things to pay attention to and communicate to his healthcare provider for a more accurate diagnosis. And it looks like he's already gone through several of the questionnaires and assessments.
So,
and he's a 30-year-old male. So I think that's why he was asking about how it changes in his life. He should look, what things he should look for.
So any assessment, and we'll talk about this a little more deeply soon, but any assessment by a professional, you need to make sure that they're asking you about your history and your childhood specifically. In order to be diagnosed as an adult with ADHD, it has to have been present in childhood. And that can be sometimes hard, even for the individual, to understand if it's there. As I mentioned earlier, if you are highly intellectual or were a child in the gifted and talented program and academics weren't necessarily a red flag, it can be harder to look back on to see where the symptoms presented themselves, usually in the social emotional realm, if it's not in the academic realm. The current DSM states it has to be both. Many of us disagree. It is, even though someone, it might, as we all know, they are still probably having issues in the academic world, but they're meeting the standard or even the above standard of whatever that is. And there aren't the resources, unfortunately, to be able to say, well, this child's in gifted and talented, they don't need resources, right? They're not saying that they could be twice exceptional. But the point being is that, you know, as an adult, it's going to be important to give as much history as you can, and think about not only the academic world, but what your social emotional world was like, so that the professional can get a really good picture of how it's presented itself. So children who take ADHD medications are more likely to abuse drugs when they become teenagers. This has always been a hot topic. And And it's still an ongoing debate, but there's science to this, and there's studies to prove that that individuals who are on ADHD medications, it is just the opposite. It's having untreated ADHD that increases the risk for an individual to abuse drugs and alcohol. Appropriate treatment reduces the risk. It is certainly true that children who have ADHD are more likely than their neurotypical peers to abuse substances. However, it's not the use of medication that's driving the effect. We know through a lot of studies that compare children with ADHD who are taking medication to children who are not taking medication. And as they've been followed over time, it has been seen that the ones who are taking medication are at no increased risk of substance abuse relative to the ones who have ADHD and are not taking medication. What's driving this misconception and very common mistake is equating correlation with causation. And why is there a risk for substance use? It's mostly in the untreated and undiagnosed ADHD, not the individuals who are medicated. Most individuals who are on medication are happy with the results of the medication. And studies show that they're not the ones seeking, right? Why are people with ADHD more likely to have substance abuse? There are a lot of theories. One is the impulsivity and poor judgment and academic difficulties that go along with ADHD that will increase the risk for initiating substance abuse in teens. There could be a genetic link between ADHD and the vulnerability for developing a substance use disorder. And individuals with ADHD might try to use psychoactive drugs to self-medicate, particularly if they are undiagnosed or untreated. They're seeking help for their brain, basically. And I think a lot of people don't understand that. The most common drugs that teens and young adults with ADHD seek are marijuana, alcohol, and nicotine. Again, if you think about it, all three of those are downers, quote unquote, right? And so they're trying to find a way to reduce the impulsivity and the hyperactivity that is going on and the millions of things swirling around in the brain. They're not looking to get high. They're looking for an escape from their symptoms, like racing thoughts. Teens and adults with ADHD may be drawn to substances that make them feel calm. The ADHD brain is wired very much like an addict's brain. And so there is risk. And it's important as parents and as adults to know that, that there's a higher predisposition for substance abuse. But again, it's because they're trying to find a way to medicate the symptoms. And individuals with ADHD, their brains tend to be more sensitive to medications. And so their responses to medications can be more intense. And so they're going to feel the effects and wind up closer to an addiction because of the effects. Teenagers with the disorder have other risk factors, like when it comes to excessive substance abuse, includes a higher risk of co-occurring disorders and environmental factors, right? So again, there's co-occurring orders going on, anxiety or depression or even bipolar, which are all three of the most common co-occurring conditions with ADHD. It's not enough that the ADHD is the only thing that's being identified. Chances are that there is another co-occurring disorder going on there. There's a more likelihood of something going on than something not going on. Any questions on substance use?
I don't see any questions, but I want to thank you for bringing that up because that's a question we get asked a lot. A lot of parents are concerned that if they put their children on medication for their ADHD, that somehow that is going to make them predisposed to abuse substances when they get older, which, you know, there have been big panels at the last couple conferences talking about how just what you said, that children, when they are treated at a younger age, the chances of them falling into substance abuse are so much lower if their ADHD is treated medically from a young age. So yeah, we're not the ones out there abusing ADHD medication. Thank you. Oh, Yulia, question.
Yeah.
Let's see. She said, if someone is abusing substances already, is it okay to start them on ADHD medication, or do they need treatment first for their addiction?
They can happen. Well, it's hard because if they're getting treatment for their addiction, a treatment center isn't going to let them have the ADHD medication. And this is an ongoing debate and topic in the substance abuse world. And it's a shame because there's a lot of facilities who are under the impression that the ADHD medication they're going to abuse. But without the ADHD medication, they're not going to be able to take in all of the strategies and tools that the treatment center is trying to help them apply. And so it is, I mean, I could go on and on about it because it's a topic that I think is one that's not being discussed enough, unfortunately.
Agreed.
Medications can cure ADHD. Again, there's a misconception among adults and teens that the medication, because so many individuals have such a positive response to medications, you know, often people claim it's as if a fog's been lifted, and they have such clarity. And it's great that they're having that positive response to the medication. But as with all mental health medications, it is a false sense of thinking that everything's okay now, right? And when anyone wants to go off any of these medications, everything comes back and comes back stronger most of the time. There's a saying among the ADHD population that pills don't teach skills. They help reduce the symptoms, and they're highly effective in that way, but they only work for 50% of the ADHD population. But they're safe. And, you know, they've been around since the mid-1940s. Ritalin is first came out in the 1940s, methylphenidate. And so they're safe. To go back to, you know, medications creating a substance abuse problem, no, they don't. And they can be very effective, but it's important to remember that they're only effective for 50% of the ADHD population. So what do you do if you're part of that population that you can't take medications? There's a lot of therapies, nutrition and lifestyle changes, brain training, and many other natural therapies that are designed to improve focus and impulsivity and many other presentations. I have found that for many individuals, the best ADHD treatment plan includes several of the following approaches, and can be used simultaneously and creatively in conjunction with medication or without. So the first one we're going to talk about is diet. And, you know, this is a controversial one because there are a lot of claims in the nutritional world, and there are a lot of professionals and experts making claims. So it's hard to determine what's true and what's not true. But we do know to date is that there are certain foods that do affect how we act and behave. And the best way to determine that is either through elimination of certain foods or allergens and being able to consume the right foods, but a part of that is the screening process, right? So food sensitivity panels are really important, and any allergen testing is really important. Individuals with ADHD, their microbiome tends to be off. We know that gut-brain connection in the ADHD world is very real. And so if someone's gut is off, their brain is off at large for the entire population. But those with ADHD are more predisposed to have more imbalances in the gut. And our gut is directly connected to our brain and all of the neurotransmitters and hormones of the brain. And so if something is off, then how we think and feel and act is going to be off. So it's really important. It's not so much, an individual should eat this certain food. If you have ADHD, I can't tell you eat this food and not this food, right? You have to go through a certain screening process and an elimination process to determine what your microbiome situation is. You can't sort of make a general statement of one versus the other. We do know that there are certain things, of eating the rainbow that works for the general population, also works for the ADHD population. Any thoughts on diet?
Elise is asking, what is a legit resource to figure out the best diet for your ADHD? Should you talk to your doctor or a nutritionist, or is there somewhere online?
Yeah, I mean, most GPs aren't trained in nutrition. So a good GP will direct you to a trained nutritionist, or an integrative and functional ND is trained. And I, in my opinion, is the most effective doctor for an ADHD person to have, because they're looking at the whole person and they're understanding all of these nuances, that it's not just about the brain. But there are specific tests that you can ask your GP to do, but the problem is, while they can order any tests, they don't necessarily know how to read the results and what that means. So my suggestion is to seek out a trained nutritionist, and particularly one who understands ADHD, or a functional doctor.
Thank you. Let's see, someone was asking, someone was asking about specific testing, but I think probably they should see their provider to find out specific testing. Let's see. Someone was making a comment. Allergists were very frustrating that they saw, because they aren't interested in their food sensitivities and reactions that fall below the threshold of what they consider a true allergy. And I guess I'm surmising from that they're pretty sensitive, because like you said, we have additional sensitivities because we have ADHD.
Yeah, it's more important to do a food sensitivity and IgG panel than it is an allergy panel.
Okay.
So if you work with just an allergist, you're going to spin your wheels.
Okay. And can you repeat the name of the type of doctor you said, that not the nutritionist, but the other type of doctor you said was really important for someone with ADHD?
Integrative and functional MD.
Okay. Thank you.
Exercise. We all know the benefits, and every day we're learning more and more on the impact of exercise in the brain for everybody. But specifically for ADHD, we know that it improves learning and memory and mood. It promotes dopamine release. It improves your executive function. It helps regulate your behavior and improve your attention. It reduces emotional dysregulation. For adults and children, there are Many forms of exercise, the martial arts, dance, ice skating, gymnastics, rock climbing, mountain biking, water paddling, and skateboarding. Those specifically because those types of movements are activating all the areas of the brain that we wanted to activate. It's balance, it's timing, it's sequencing, it's evaluating consequences, it's switching, it's error correcting, it's fine motor adjustments, it's inhibition, and intense focus and concentration. That is, we're not only exercising for our physical bodies to get strong, but these types of movements and exercises the brain and strengthens the executive function system. And you have to think about it like a muscle that needs to be exercised. Any thoughts on exercise?
Surprisingly, no one has any thoughts about exercise. Let's see, what if all we want to do is exercise? Oh, Sarah's hyper-focused on exercise, it sounds like.
Yeah, well, you have to be careful. You want to be smart about it, right? We can exercise every day. It's important to exercise different parts of our bodies on different days. You want to make sure that if you're hyper-focused on something like exercise, that you're not using it to replace, you're avoiding something probably, and it's replacing something else. So as with any certain type of habit, where you think it's good because you're exercising, but there sounds like there's some layers there that need to get peeled back. Vitamin and mineral supplements. This is becoming more discussed and used. I'm a huge fan of Dr. James Greenblatt, who wrote the book Finally Focused, and who is an integrative and functional psychiatrist and is on the East Coast, as many great ones are. He was one of the first to really dive into looking at some of the reasons for some of the symptoms and traits of ADHD and its connection to deficiencies. Diet is great, but if there are deficiencies and there are sensitivities, then we can't always get the food or nutrition we need. It has been found that individuals with ADHD are more likely to have deficiencies in iron and zinc, magnesium, D, B, copper, how you store iron. There's the MTHFR genetic mutation. We are learning more, which is great. And there are ways that some individuals' symptoms can be decreased greatly, and some even disappear if we find some deficiencies and that we're able to support those deficiencies and see that a lot of certain types of symptoms are greatly decreased because of it. Studies have looked at the effects of amino acids, vitamins, minerals, and omega-3 fatty acids. Any thoughts on that?
No, nothing, but that's really great because we've had that question come up in our adult support group the last 2 weeks in a row. People were asking about supplements specifically, so this is really helpful.
Yeah. And there are therapies. There's cognitive behavioral therapy, that's a treatment that helps you identify and change sort of destructive thought patterns that influence our behavior and emotions. What does CBT do for ADHD? There's a lot of evidence to support all of the benefits that occur in the executive function system, because we have unpacked all of the negative automatic thinking patterns, particularly for adults who were unidentified in childhood and what they're walking around with now as adults. And when that gets addressed, then the result is higher self-esteem and productivity and happiness. Acceptance and commitment therapy is also very beneficial for the ADHD population. It's an extension of CBT, but has some differences. And one of the key components is that acceptance and commitment therapy understands that importance is not necessarily going to have the ADHD individual. Stressing the importance of something is not going to make the ADHD individual do something. And it's not enough. So what acceptance and commitment therapy does is help you determine what your values are. And I use this often in my practice in combination with CBT to help not only have them understand their values, because once you attach meaning to something and a value to something, then, you know, just getting an A to most kids isn't important enough. But if they're able to uncover that, well, I really value, I want to have this kind of life or career or lifestyle, and that's meaningful to me, then the motivation winds up increasing rather than stressing. The A is a letter to them, and for a lot of kids means nothing. And it's the same in adulthood. Acceptance and commitment therapy also teaches an individual to sort of lean in to the discomfort of certain feelings and emotions and thoughts, and build some resiliency as a result. Neurofeedback. Neurofeedback can be very effective for the ADHD population, but again, everyone's brain is different. Not every person with ADHD is going to see results. It depends on the neurofeedback program. It depends on the trainer. There's a lot of outside forces at play there. But we're getting more and more scientific studies showing significant improvement in individuals with ADHD. I myself am trained and use a program for my clients, and you know, its impact can be on, even if it's just one symptom, can be great. I think it's helping individuals create a realistic set of expectations when using things like neurofeedback. And mindfulness. Mindfulness, as I mentioned earlier, is really an opportunity. One of the best ways to exercise that attention and focus muscle, and leaning into the discomfort. I can't tell you how many of my clients, young and old, when I recommend meditation or yoga, the eye rolls and the, oh, I can't do that, it's too slow and there's no way. And the second I hear that, I say, well, then that's the exact reason why you should be doing it. You know, if you're not uncomfortable in the slow, then you need to learn how to become comfortable in the slow. And as a whole, having that sense of being able to be is very, very valuable. It helps with impulsivity and emotion reactions. And I mean, the list goes on and on and on. So medicine prescriptions for ADHD have increased over the past years because this is being overdiagnosed. ADHD is not being overdiagnosed. If anything, it's still being underdiagnosed and misdiagnosed. There's no evidence to support that it's being overdiagnosed. What's happening is that, you know, individuals are gaining more education on it, and so therefore are feeling more comfortable, which is great, in trying to get assessed. And we're learning more about the brain, and we're getting better at diagnosing. And so that is why there's an uptick in the diagnosing numbers, and an uptick in the medication prescriptions. Again, how do you get an accurate ADHD diagnosis? You have to make sure it's not enough that someone has PhD or MD after their name. A lot of those individuals who go through medical and nursing school did not receive adequate training when it comes to ADHD. You want to find somebody who has done additional specialized training. It's not the degree that matters, it's the training that they have had. that is how you're going to receive an accurate diagnosis. And it's common for ADHD. Oop, I skipped a slide. So people say ADHD, who have ADHD, use it as an excuse for their behavior. It's not an excuse. Again, individuals with ADHD and the impairment on their executive function system is very real. And don't confuse the impairment and the symptoms that is being presented as an excuse. Individuals, often hear many things like everybody has ADHD, or I had an ADHD moment. And it's not accurate. It is the disorder of inconsistency. And so it's hard for people to really understand it. It can be puzzling for individuals who don't have ADHD. But the truth is that people with ADD have a tremendous amount of energy, and they use a lot of effort and just to organize and focus and keep themselves on track. Bottom line, it's important to avoid minimizing or outright dismissing ADHD. Avoid saying things like it isn't real, or why don't we just let kids be kids, or other adults who say, oh, I have an ADD moment, or I have a little bit of ADHD too, or let's just be, why don't we let kids be kids anymore? It's important to understand this is a real condition. It affects children and adults with recognizable symptoms. There are a lot of inaccurate beliefs about ADHD and how often this prevents parents of children with ADHD and adults from seeking the support and assessment. It's really important that we correct any misconceptions that are out there so that those of us who have the condition can have a more improved quality of life and feel supported in seeking their fulfillment and their potential.
That was fantastic. Thank you so much. And thank you for being so great about answering all our questions, because I know some of them were, kind of hot buttons. So I really appreciate it. We actually do have a couple other questions. Shanna is interested in having you explain a little bit more about neurofeedback and how it helps with executive functioning.
So neurofeedback is, it is directly connected to, through EEG, it is receiving, let's see if I can go through my neurofeedback slide. Basically what it does is, the program is measuring the amount of information it's taking, right? So there are electric activity and signals from your brain, which is the neuro part, and the information that is fed back to your brain over and over again is the feedback part. So if there is something that keeps popping up, if there's something in the brain, be it impulsivity or hyperactivity, or inattention or distractibility, the program, if it is designed in such a way, will pick up that information off the brain. And the whole feedback loop is that that information is picked up and sent back to the brain, right? So this is like the true leaning into discomfort. The brain is going to determine whether it wants to receive that information, if it's ready to receive that information at that point in time. And it can require, this is why no neurofeedback provider can tell you how many sessions it's going to take, right? The brain is going to decide how often it needs that information fed back to it. It's like unwinding the habit loop, right? How many times does my brain need to experience this discomfort before it's ready to fully experience this discomfort and let it go? And it's different for everybody.
Great, thank you. Someone also had a specific question about a supplement, a Chinese herb called, I will try, Romania or Shu de Huang. If you've ever heard of it and have any input on it.
I haven't. I mean, you know, a lot of the herbal sort of Eastern practices haven't been studied as much as the nutritional deficiencies and malabsorption and mineral panel. It depends on what it is they're trying to treat, right? Like, are they working on what symptom or trait is causing them difficulty? And is that particular supplement able to impact that in any way?
Thank you. Did anybody else have any questions that they wanted to share in the chat before we wrap up? It looks like no. So I want to thank you so much. Every time you come to speak to our group, we are all left so much wiser and so much more connected. You know, hearing all of that. Some of those, sometimes when people say to you, oh, everybody has a little bit of ADHD, or it's, you know, it can be really, really frustrating. So it is so lovely to hear those myths busted and, you know, be able to come together as a community and know that, you know, we're all kind of hearing these things and we can all go out there better informed. So thank you so much. And I threw this last slide up there so that you guys can see the other things that we have coming up. We have our young women's group, our adult peer support group, our parenting group, and then we have our next speaker session, I think, is the 23rd of next month. But you can find it on Meetup because my own ADHD, I don't remember the exact date. So thank you guys so much for being here. We really, really appreciate it. And thank you to everybody who donated or became members. We really appreciate it. And if anybody has any questions, I'm going to stay after. And I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have about Chad or about our work or about ADHD. Thank you so much, Kristin.
Thank you, Suzanne.
Thank
Thank you,
you so
everyone.
much. Thank you. Thank you.